Hello, my name is Colin Cook. This is my presentation for Eastern New Mexico University, Business 501, Ethics, Law, and Social Responsibility. My topic is law enforcement corruption. Introduction, law enforcement corruption. Define common forms of corruption, examples of corruption, causes of corruption, negative impact to stakeholders, solutions to corruption, and finally reference today. Defined, law enforcement corruption are abuses of power and authority. Procedural corruption refers to a violation of departmental rules. For example, many departments have a policy that officers should identify themselves if requested by citizens. Criminal corruption refers to the violation of state and federal laws. Unconstitutional corruption refers to a violation of civil rights. Common forms of corruption. Discriminatory arrest. Discriminatory arrest we could see an example of in New York City, where they had the stop and frisk procedure, stop and frisk law, that was ruled unconstitutional and that targeted minorities. Physical and verbal harassment, selective enforcement of the law, which is choosing which laws to enforce and which not to. Excessive use of force, robbing of drug dealers, redirecting of contraband into the personal accounts of officers, perjuring oneself to protect a corrupt officer, planning drugs to frame citizens, falsifying police reports, and commission lying, creating a perception by words that purposefully create deception. Examples of corruption. This comes from New York Daily News. 12 minority officers sued the NYPD, New York Police Department, claiming the department uses numbers-driven police tactics. For example, numbers-driven tactics would involve setting quotas for officers, like you have to write 10 speeding tickets per week. Speaking out stunts the careers of officers, something to keep in mind when we look at Democracy Now! It says 2 Chicago police officers say they have faced retaliation and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after blowing the whistle on fellow officers who demanded money from drug dealers. So here we have 2 cases of a lack of whistleblower protection, and as such, possible retaliation. And in this case, PTSD was suffered after blowing the whistle and not being protected. This comes from Juarez. It's a book called Brother of Corruption. It talks about his time in the Chicago Police Department. He says, one officer, disorderly conduct always works as a false charge. The power, fury, and authority of police officers enthralled him. He had a feeling that something was wrong and uncertainty about respect or fear towards officers. Next, Stanford University Journals. This is a famous case involving Officer Frank Serpico. In the 1960s, Officer Frank Serpico at New York Department was involved in falsifying drug evidence. Serpico cautioned the commission that prevention of police misconduct needed an ever-present commission checking local departments. So Serpico cautioned the commission in the 1960s to have some type of department or commission checking the law enforcement agencies or departments, and his advice and his cautionary measures were not taken into consideration. You can see in December 1994, 9 New Orleans police officers were arrested and charged with protecting the storage and movement of 130 kilograms of cocaine in exchange for $97,000 in bribes. Legal Information Institute talks about this case, which is Plumhoff versus Ricard. 2 officers fired 13 shots when a man would not stop his car and nearly hit an officer. After the shots were fired, Ricard lost control of his vehicle, killing himself and a passenger. This case has to deal with the excessive use of force. 13 shots were fired. They did not know if the man had a weapon or was armed. CNN reports 4 Oakland police officers were charged with attempted sexual assault, lewd conduct in public, assisting in the crime of prostitution, being untruthful to investigators, and failing to report a violation of the law. And 7 other officers, they were suspended and accused of accessing a law enforcement database for personal gain, failing to report a violation of the law, and bringing disrepute to the department. Relatedly, Fox 13 Salt Lake City reports 3 female officers filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against the city and Deputy Chief Rick Finlay. Finlay is accused of taking and sharing photos of the women in bikinis without consent. Further, USattorneys.com reported that Officer Reed filed a lawsuit against her superior officer, Taylor. Taylor is accused of using a gender-specific insult towards Reed. Human Resources ignored her complaint. Due to her complaint, Officer Reed was reprimanded for failing to greet a superior officer. So in this case, again, we have sexual harassment, and even more importantly about this is that the sexual harassment was reported, and it was not taken into consideration. It was ignored by proper authority to report the case to. And again, retaliation is featured here with the officer, superior officer, harassing Reed, reprimanding her for failing to greet the superior officer. Next, causes of corruption. The Internet Journal of Criminology states intentions of law enforcement officers at the start of their careers are often genuine and with good intention. Officers can be overwhelmed as experience on the job lengthens. Traits such as cynicism and pessimism can emerge, where they might start with good intentions and then later be overwhelmed and produce the traits of cynicism and pessimism. For example, another profession that might have a similar situation would be attorneys. This comes from Balco. The book is Rise of the Warrior Cop. President Reagan made grants for surplus military gear to go to police. This was called the 1033 program, and this is where we get a lot of the militarization of the police force with weapons and tanks and vehicles and things that don't belong in necessarily for policing citizens. Next, we're going to look at the University of California, Davis Police Academy training video.
The UC Davis Police Department Cadet Program focuses on a big portion of our community, which is our undergrad student population. The reason
you can see from the video the use of shaky cam, looks like an action video, a very intense kind of situation, knocking doors down. And then we can see the result of this sort of militarization of the police force when we look at the University of California, Davis student protesters being pepper sprayed. Next, we're going to look at the negative impact to stakeholders. This will be further analysis to end law enforcement corruption. There's already been a number of unethical behaviors that law enforcement officers have committed, but we're going to look further and focus more on the stakeholders just briefly. This comes from Community Policing Dispatch. The primary stakeholders in policing are the citizens. These stakeholders are affected by the problems being addressed and will benefit from the solution. So the stakeholders, one of the primary stakeholders for law enforcement agencies are citizens, and they need to be protected. The problem is they often have some altercations, or they're often the victims of some of the law enforcement corruption. We'll look next at this article came from the Huffington Post, Cost of Settling Lawsuits Against Law Enforcement Officers. And you can see 4 different cities listed here, and of course the biggest city, New York City, $348 million between 2006 and 2011. It's about 5 years, maybe $350 million almost to settle lawsuits against the law enforcement agencies. And Chicago is going to have the largest number on this list. It's also 10 years as opposed to New York's 5, but it's $521 million. Next, we're going to look at solutions to corruption. This comes from Media Impact Funders. Dispersed leadership. Similar to a decentralized organization, dispersed leadership could help abate the hierarchy of law enforcement agencies and give police more autonomy. So it might be a little bit scary to give police more autonomy, but in this situation where we're decentralizing the organization, a positive example could be police using discretion to not police by the numbers, which we talked about earlier. So some of those 12 minority police officers who filed a lawsuit against the New York Police Department, perhaps in a situation like this, they would have more autonomy to be able to make the proper decisions about how many speeding tickets or how many different tickets they would have to write for a certain period of time. This comes from Balco, Rise of the Warrior Cop. Ending federal grants that encourage police forces to acquire military equipment that is deemed excessive and is more appropriate for the battlefield. Those federal grants, that 1033 plan, it is critical to change the culture of militarization in American law enforcement. This comes from the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin. It says hire candidates who have high ethical standards and identify employees early in their careers who have low ethical standards. Using new methods of testing which determine officers' psychological propensity to act ethically. Screen candidates and hire the most conscientious ones. Conscientiousness can be assessed through conduct. FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin recommends prudence, trust, effacement of self-interests, courage, intellectual honesty, justice, and responsibility as some of the positive attributes to look for law enforcement officers. The Internet Journal of Criminology states, an officer should become truthful in word and deed because truthfulness has become second nature to them. Business ethics, ethical decision-making in cases, talks about opportunity, the conditions in an organization that restrict or allow for ethical or unethical behavior. Opportunity results from conditions that provide incentives or fail to install barriers against unethical behavior. Opportunity relates to individuals' immediate job context, which includes where they work, whom they work with, and the nature of their work. So, to improve law enforcement and to stop corruption, eliminating the opportunity for corruption by improving the law enforcement culture could help. And using technology like body cameras and dashboard cameras could also help eliminate the opportunity for unethical behavior. Next, we have an exacting culture shows little concern for people, but rather focuses on performance. Moving towards an integrative culture that has a high concern for people could help the culture of law enforcement, could help the ethical nature of law enforcement. Concern for people, and I don't mean citizens, I'm talking about law enforcement officials, these officers who have PTSD, the officers who experience violent crimes. They need to have that integrative culture that cares about them. Differential association is the learning of ethics through interaction with people who are part of their organization or personal group. So 40% of employees follow the culture in their work group. So in this case, when you have these departments, Frank Serpico's New York Police Department, the New Orleans Department, the departments that had chiefs who were committing sexual harassment, 40% of employees will follow the culture in their work group, and that's just too high of a number to be participating in this unethical and corrupt. Develop a proper reporting location for reports of misconduct. These include supervisors, higher management, human resources, a hotline, ethics officer, an outsider legal department, and some type of governmental authority. And to protect whistleblowers. We saw 2 cases where whistleblowers were not protected. We saw a case where the human resources department ignored a report of misconduct, and that needs to be addressed for an ethical culture. Sexual harassment is any repeated unwanted behavior sexual in nature and perpetrated by one individual to another. Establish rules for determining and reporting harassment. Establish rules for enforcement of cases in a timely manner. Develop a stakeholder culture which emphasizes citizens. Create positive relationships with stakeholders. Involve corporate governance, which maintains systems of accountability, oversight, and control. Establishing core values. Here is an example. This is Marriott Hotels, a huge hotel chain. These are their 5 core values, and number 1 is put people first. 2 is pursue excellence. 3 is embrace change. 4, act with integrity. And 5 is serve our world. And I think despite this being the massive hotel chain that it is, these type of core values would apply to law enforcement agencies, law enforcement departments, and officers. Establishing codes of conduct. A code of ethics and a statement of values can develop an organizational ethics program. Codes of conduct describe the expectation of employees. Codes of ethics describe principles for the rules of conduct. A code of ethics can describe methods for reporting violations, disciplinary action for violations, and a structure of due process. Important things for law enforcement division. Statement of value serves the public and addresses stakeholders. And finally, misconduct declines as an ethical culture matures. So if these types of things can be established, the misconduct could decline in the future. Create principles that are specific and pervasive for behavior. These include human rights, freedom of speech, and the fundamentals of justice. Create values that are ideal and socially enforced. Promote integrity, promote honesty, promote fairness. The aforementioned can lead to creating a better law enforcement culture and moving towards the elimination of corruption. These are my references. I'm sure you can pause the video if you want to have some more details, if you'd like to read about any of these cases. Some of these are books. Of course, there's the peer-reviewed articles, peer-reviewed journals. Let's do one more. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation about law enforcement corruption.